Welcome back to a check-in episode where we feature the work of guests who've appeared in a prior episode. I'm Martin Nutty, and you're listening to the Irish Stew podcast. Since Maurice Casey last appeared on the podcast in season 3, back in January 2022, there have been significant changes in his life. He's moved on from his post as historian in residence at Dublin's fabulous Epic Museum to take up a position as a research fellow in Belfast at Queen's University. This year, Footnote Press published Maurice's first book, Hotel Luxe, an intimate history of communism's forgotten radicals. The book has received stellar reviews and was nominated by An Post Irish Book Awards in the Hodges Figgis History Book of the Year category. I'm delighted to welcome the extraordinarily talented Maurice Casey back to Irish Stew.
Thanks, Martin. It's very kind of you.
So I'm going to kick this off. You're at the Irish Book Awards recently, I believe, in the Convention Centre of Dublin. Tell us about that evening.
Oh, it was great fun. The Irish Book Awards is the Christmas party of the Irish publishing industry. So you have authors, publishers, publicist agents. And when the shortlist was announced, it was announced in the GPO back in October. And one of the people who organizes the awards got up and told everyone to prepare their livers. And that was my first indication of the Irish Book Awards reputation as quite a boozy evening. And it lived up to that reputation, but it was a lot of fun. And I got to meet a lot of people who I've grown up with just on the TV. Hector O'Huckagon was there, for example, chatted to him for a little while. And he was just as friendly in his demeanor as he's presented on TV as well. So it was definitely a case of meeting your heroes and not being disappointed, because I think that there was a real friendliness. And I think that comes through as well in my wider experiences of the Irish publishing and literary industry. It's a very open world, very friendly. People want to help each other out. And the Book Awards is one example of that, because it's quite democratic. It's not just highlighting the big hitters. They're also highlighting debut authors like myself, and also books that wouldn't necessarily get a look in other awards, for example, Irish language books. So it's a really fantastic evening, really vibrant community get-together.
Yeah, it sounds like good time. And I think Hector won in the Irish book category, I believe.
Yeah, I think Irish Published Book of the Year was his one.
So since we last had you on the podcast, as I mentioned in the preamble, back then you were working at Epic Museum. You've moved on to Queen's University. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about that transition.
Yeah, it was interesting. I guess interesting as well in just terms of thinking about the geographical move, right? I grew up in Tipperary, a small town called Cahir. Did my undergrad in Dublin. So I've always felt Cahir is definitely my home, but Dublin's a kind of a second home. When I came back for the Epic role in 2020 after doing my graduate studies, then I was back in Dublin for a bit of time. And I was getting my feet in Dublin, and that's when I got this job in Queen's University of Belfast. And I decided to take it, decided to make the move up, and I'm really glad I did. I've really loved Belfast as a city. It really surprised me in many ways. I think that a lot of people who grew up in the south don't think of coming up here. I found it quite striking how many people that I know in Dublin don't realize that it's just a 2-hour train, really. And now those trains are hourly. And that it's a really friendly city. Cost of living's great. That's a big plus for people who are dealing with Dublin prices. And it's a city on the up with, of course, a history that plays out in a number of ways. But I definitely think that there's a sense of community here. There's a sense of the city getting back on its feet and getting up and going, being a community-wide project. And also what has been really interesting is the strength of the Irish language in Belfast. That really struck me. As soon as I got here, I don't think there's a city in Ireland that has a stronger Irish language community. It's a really living language up here. There's Irish language pubs. There's Irish language classes. You can do a semester Irish language classes for £50. Works out as something like £2 an hour. So there's also like a 24-hour Irish language radio station. And that, again, was a big surprise. So I've really enjoyed the transition, and it's really given me a new understanding of my own place within Ireland And I think that people up north are very keen for Irish people to come and visit. Now, what I've also noticed, and it's interesting for the purposes of your own audience, Martin, the degree to which a united Ireland exists in the Irish tourism industry, right? No one flies into London to go to Belfast. They fly into Dublin and they do Belfast, they do maybe Donegal, Galway, Kerry, and then back to Dublin and fly out again. So the tourist economy very much feels like there's no borders. But in other ways, when you live here, you do get a sense of where the divisions do lie.
Yeah, John Lee, my co host, and I just spent 5 days up in Belfast quite recently, and we're going to have a 10 or 12 episodes coming out about that particular trip. And my reactions are very similar to yours, although I will admit to dropping the ball on the Irish language aspect of this. I was aware that it was vibrant, but I didn't have the opportunity in the limited amount of time we had to participate in that experience. But like you, I would echo the sense of a friendliness and just being blown away by the city itself. Its built environment is really interesting to me because it's like that high Victorian thing. It's all over the place there. And it's just a really fun place to visit. And I also had the pleasure, actually, my youngest niece, Irish niece, is just started in Queen's University and she's studying mathematics there. And so if you come across a Shiva Nutty, you will know exactly who that is, or at least how she ties to me, because as in Ireland, and I think you kind of reflect a little bit on that on the Irish Book Awards, everybody realizes there are 2 degrees of separation apart from each other.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
so I think that contributes to the sense of informality and a more relaxed state that you find in Ireland, maybe than many other countries.
Yeah,
I don't know if
yeah.
you see that as well. You've traveled quite a bit, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. I think Irish people, there's an openness amongst Irish people. And when you travel, there's also an openness to Irish people. And we'll talk about this when we're talking about the book. But for the book, I spent time in Ukraine. I spent time in Russia as well. That was back in 2017 and 2018. And I definitely think Irishness traveled there in a way in Eastern Europe and opened doors. So I think that, yeah, it always helps.
So I think moving on to the book, I noticed in your Queen's bio that you are investigating a new field of study on history and video games. And
Yeah.
I also understand that one of the origin points of your book was actually Call of Duty, I believe, back in 2012. So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a sort of a strange intellectual origin. I grew up, my mom is a retired history teacher. So always growing up surrounded by history books. And my mom always encouraged that interest. But what made me interested in Soviet history, which became a key strand of my career as a historian, was Christmas of 2005 when I was 12 years old and I got an Xbox 360 and Call of Duty 2. And Call of Duty 2 opens with the Red Army and you're a soldier in Moscow during the Second World War. And that sparked my interest in Soviet history, which led me to the history of communism. And another one of my kind of intellectual touch points as a teenager after I got into Soviet history, I think it was my mom who recommended I watch Warren Beatty's 1980s film Reds. And I think I must have been 13 or 14 when I watched that. And that was hugely influential in how I understood Russian history. And sometimes I tell people that my book is Reds too, in a way. And I hope if listeners haven't watched Reds, it's a perfect Christmas film because it's really long, plenty of snow, and it's one that you really want to get cozy and watch. But it's a stunning film, deserves to be better known. It's got Warren Beatty, Jan Keaton, Jack Nicholson, stunning cast, and the whole plot is about Americans in revolutionary Russia just after the revolution.
I think it's an extraordinary film. I'm actually surprised that it was made in the period of time that it was made in, given how virulently anti Russia, let's call it anti Soviet America, which stands in contrast, of course, to contemporary American politics, where there seems to be a lot of rapprochement between the Republican Party and figures in modern day Russia. But
Mm.
maybe it's not a good idea to go there because we will disappear down into that sinkhole. But yes, echo that. Reds, phenomenal film. I saw it probably 30 years ago. And you know what? I probably should go watch it again and just see if it's as good
Yeah.
as I remembered it being.
Oh, it definitely
Um,
is. Yeah.
but speaking of other book origin points, I understand your book and one of its major characters originated from curiosity and a single footnote. So tell
Yeah,
us about that.
that's right. So I began my PhD in 2016, towards the end of 2016. And my PhD topic was Irish women and international communism. So to try and link together the kind of intellectual biography there, you have this 12-year-old who's in rural Tipperary, becomes very interested in Soviet history. Then I went on to study history at Trinity College in Dublin. But all of the modules I could take, just the way that it landed was that I could only study really Irish history. And I had always had this interest in Soviet history. So I tried to find the Soviet angle within the Irish history module. And that led me to look at the history of communism, particularly in the early 20th century in Ireland. And when it got to PhD stage, I found this world of what I thought to be a quite suggestive world of interlinked women in particular, who transitioned from the suffrage movement, from the first wave of feminism, into communism after the Russian Revolution of 1917. So I decided I would look at the Irish angle of that. And the early days of my research, I found this footnote in a landmark history of Ireland and the international communist movement. And the footnote said that there was a reference to an Irish woman who lived in Moscow in the 1920s in an old, long out of print communist memoir from the 1930s. So I ordered that memoir. It's called An American Testament. It was written by a man by the name of Joseph Freeman, who was born in Ukraine, left when he was a child for Brooklyn, grew up really as an American, but always his Ukrainian Jewish identity was a very important part of his journey. And he goes on this journey of almost ancestral return in 1926. He moves to Moscow and he becomes a translator in the headquarters of the international communist movement. And as he describes in his memoir, his boss, when he was translating in the Kremlin Palace, when he was translating all these like major revolutionary documents, his boss was an Irish woman. And I just became so fascinated and fixated by that. The kind of question of how and why, who was this Irish woman? How did she not only end up in 1920s Moscow, but how did she have the skills to arise to that kind of position? And then how did she fall into total obscurity to the extent that the only real published reference to her was this mention in an old memoir that actually used a pseudonym, OB. And so I set out to find the real identity of OB. And that was the beginning of 7 years really of research into the life of May O'Callaghan, who was Joseph Freeman's OB in his memoir. And that research took me across the world, really, from the Pacific Northwest to Spain, to Ukraine, to Russia, all along the while, meeting a lot of descendants of people who were part of Mayo Callahan's world, learning Russian, and really rebuilding her social circle to the extent that I could with the material that survived, and particularly building the social circle around where she lived, which is from the title of the book, the Hotel Luxe, a hotel in central Moscow that became the living quarters of the foreign revolutionaries who traveled to Moscow in the 1920s.
Yeah, and it's interesting the name of that building, the Hotel Lux, because as I read it, it's far from Lux at all.
Yeah, it was a pretty rundown place. It was set up in 1913, very boutique, very much appealing to an upper middle class traveler. But then when the Bolsheviks seize it in 1919, it's low on their priorities to maintenance and upkeep. So it quickly descends into a place where there's cockroaches, a perpetually broken elevator, food's terrible, it can be freezing. You have to share your room often with another visiting revolutionary who are not always very keen on keeping your own personal space. But everyone who lived there, it was a crossing point in their lives. It attracted people at a certain moment in their lives when they were young, seeking to rebuild the world, idealistic, hopeful that could be achieved. And so it's not the inconvenience or the poor conditions necessarily that becomes highlighted in their reflections, but it's the remarkable atmosphere of the hotel in that period.
Yeah, and just the cast of characters that you have in the book, they're all in the Hotel Luxe, and they're
Mm.
international. Some from Germany, some from America. Joseph Friedman, who you referred to already, they're there for the Comintern. So tell our listeners a bit about the Comintern because may not be familiar with it and
Yeah.
exactly what was it that drew them all in.
The early 20th century, particularly the wake of the First World War, sees the development of the international organizations today that have descendants in institutions like the United Nations, for example. In the wake of the First World War, you see the rise of the League of Nations, Soviet communist counterpoint in the Communist International, which is just shortened to Comintern. It was established in 1919 under Lenin's guidance as a organizing body for world communist parties that would train the revolutionaries of the world in how the Bolsheviks became successful in bringing through their revolution. The idea would be that the Comintern would then export the Bolshevik model of revolution to all the countries of the world. And so this headquarters becomes a intrinsically international world because the designs of the Comintern were global in nature. And its range of operations was also vast. Everything from just simple fact finding, gathering info on various world leaders, all the way up to funneling arms into countries to incite insurrections. But what's interesting for my world and where the characters in my book enter into this world is that any organization of that scale, of that ambition, also needs ordinary technical workers, the people who file the receipts, who type up the documents, who do the translation. And I became so fascinated in that tier of the revolutionary workforce and what could be recovered by them through following this Irish woman who was part of that workforce through her life in the Hotel Luxe and reconstructing that social world. I was really fortunate in a way that I followed Mayo Callahan in particular. She was a very vivacious, very charismatic person. She was very intellectually accomplished. She could speak fluently French, German, Russian, of course, her native English. She grew up in Wexford in a small village called Ballinesker. And she drew people to her. And her room in the Hotel Lux, which was room 5, became a real crossing point, a gathering point. And it allowed me to piece together these other lives of people who came into her orbit. And so that's why the book took so long to research, really, was that I was very committed to tracing, as to the best of my abilities, the descendants of the people who came into her world to see what had survived of the material of this world of people who are very obscure, very enigmatic. They're not the leading revolutionaries. They're not the kind of people who usually get archived or get attention from historians. There was a lot of detective work involved, but I enjoyed it all.
So this is an extraordinary group of people in a way, but they're forgotten mostly. Why should we care in 2024 about them?
I think that the dreams of that era, or rather the questions they asked of their world, were questions that are still very pertinent today about how do you build a world of lasting equality, of justice? How do you transcend racism, inequality? These kind of questions were really pressing to that generation. Of course, so many felt so darkly and deeply betrayed by what came of the revolution. But even when they got involved in the 1920s, it involved moral compromises. It involved accommodations with revolutionary violence. I was just interested in that complexity of life. I was interested in dealing with the knottiness of what it really means to commit yourself to a revolution. What does that entail in terms of compromises, but also what can come in terms of the rewards of living a life of total commitment? So I think these lives that I look at in particular are much more resonant to us today than, for example, picking up a biography of Lenin or even the revered suffragette Sylvia Pankhurst, who's also a character in the book. The lives of the people that I looked at are much more closer to us in temperament, in outlook, and in day to day life experience. People like Sylvia Pankhurst, for example, she didn't sleep 2 nights a week because she was so committed to producing writing on revolutionary topics at such a scale. Now, I need to get to sleep by 11 p.m. I work my 9 to 5. I don't always do the reading, but I do my best. And so the people that I researched were the people who were doing their best in the 1920s. And they were capable of extraordinarily courageous acts, in addition to euphemistic phrasing of violence that is also so striking to research and read about today. So it's a knotty story of human complexity that I've just found so rewarding to grapple with. And I hope the readers do too.
Yeah, I certainly did. And one of the things that I enjoyed about your book was the fact that you were also writing about your reactions to your research efforts. So, talk about putting yourself as a character in the book as well.
Yeah. So this was a real conscious decision from the outset of the book. It was a real core part of how I imagined the book coming together. There are 4 chapters which are explicitly written in the first person, and they're about my journeys into the archives. And I also appear elsewhere at different points in the text as well. As a historian, the research is the most exciting part. And a lot of my decision to become a professional historian was in this experience when I was an undergrad and I was told to go into the archives the first time. And I found this material of, at that point, I was researching Irish revolutionaries in the 1910s, 1920s. I found this material that was so rich with the texture of ordinary human lives. And yet, when I'd go into the library and I'd read the academic literature on the same people, I found that so much of that texture had gotten lost in the translation from it being a primary source to being a secondary account by a historian. Putting myself into my book was a way of me to try and retain a bit of that excitement, to point out to people, like, look, these people really existed. There's an amazing amount of detail on their lives that we can recover, but also to pull out that what is to me a very interesting point, which is that I'm also working with fragments. There's a lot that I don't know, and there's reasons why I don't know that. There's reasons why material survives and other material does not. And that is often when you're working like I do with the archives held by family members in attics or in sheds or so on. The reason that material survives is often about the bond that connects one generation to the other. And I'm sure everyone here has material that they inherited from their grandparents or so on. And that, as well, is a story of intimacy. It's a story of how we in the present are connected to those in the past. And so I was really keen to use my own story of research as a way of getting into that intimate story. And it has been great. I've gotten a lot of readers do seem to really enjoy it. I was worried that it would seem a bit navel gazing, but I think it was also important to point out that I researched this book at a very particular time, which in hindsight is very clearly a window in time of opportunity. When, for example, I went to Ukraine in 2017, which is where I was learning Russian. When I went to Moscow in 2018, which was just in the wake of the World Cup, that research would not be possible today. And that to me was something that I felt important to point out as well, that it's not that we're on a kind of gradual path towards knowing more and more. There is different factors in the world that block us off from historical knowledge and research.
Yeah, sometimes doors slam shut. We always like to think that they're going to open up to us. And I did really enjoy your travels in the book and your discoveries. And also, I will admit to a little bit of envy when you talk about fetching up on the Galatian coast in search
Mhm.
of an archive. I believe it was the grandson of one of your characters, a gentleman. His first name is Pedro. I'm forgetting his last name, but he
Yeah,
is the grandson of Nellie Cohn, I believe. Was it
no,
Nellie
sorry,
Cohn?
Emmy
Sorry,
Leonhard.
Leonard. Sorry.
Yeah.
Talk to us about encountering the descendants of these people. And
Yeah,
did you end up connecting them or anything like that? Or
I there have been some connections that I've made between people. Joyce is a figure in the book. She's really spent a lot of the book as a child. She's born in 1929. She grew up to become a piano teacher in London. And so through my research, a reunion of her old piano students was brought together. So that was really fun to get to meet a lot of people who had been connected to her. Pedro, I think Pedro and his family history, I think that to me was one of the really fascinating parts of writing this book of my entire career, really. Pedro, as readers will discover in the book, is the grandson of a very remarkable revolutionary couple. His grandmother, Emmy Leonhard, was born into a wealthy Hamburg banking family in the 1890s. She left all that behind, became a committed revolutionary, was in the Hotel Luxe in Moscow in 1925. That's where Pedro's aunt, Elisa, was born. And Pedro's grandfather, Edo Fimin, was a Dutch trade unionist, someone who was a canary in the coal mine for the fight against European fascism. He actually signed a petition calling for the workers of the world to resist fascism days before Hitler's Munich push of 1923. And from the late 1920s onwards, Edo, foreseeing what is coming to a great extent, begins building a network of resistance. And then when the Nazis rise to power in 1933, Emmy and Emmy's two children with Edo, Elisa and Alida, Pedro's aunt and mother respectively, they all go together into exile. And part of my book as well traces that family's exile journey. And again, it is a story that would have been entirely foreclosed to me were it not for the fact that so much of their material had survived in the care of this grandson, Pedro. They would have simply disappeared into the archival record and reappeared at the end of the war in Switzerland, and I would have known nothing else about them. But there's a really remarkable set of documents that survived that allowed me to trace in extraordinary detail, year by year, how that family survived as people who held extremely dangerous identities as anti-Nazi and anti-Nazi resistance family.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story. And one of the documents, or let's say a set of the documents, of course, is the Alpenpost, which I
Yes.
loved. And you've published some of them, or at least some images from the Alpenpost on your wonderful Substack blog. So a shout out for that one, the Archive Rats, I believe it's called.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so
Um,
talk to us about the Alpenpost, because I was smitten with this, and I think
yeah.
you probably were as well.
Oh, for sure. Now, the Alpenpost is without a doubt the most extraordinary historical source I've ever used. And this, again, was something I found in Galicia in Pedro's care. When the Leonhard family went into exile, they split up effectively. Edo remained in Amsterdam, which was where he was organizing resistance efforts until 1939 when he evacuated to London. And in order to keep his family safe, they remained separate from him for most of the time. At first, they were in Switzerland, then they moved from Paris to London, and then the family moved together to Mexico. In order for this father to keep updated on the lives of his partner and their two children, his two very precocious girls, Elisa and Alida, decided when they were around 11 and 9, respectively, they decided to begin handcrafting a twice monthly newspaper that they sent to their father in his anti Nazi resistance headquarters, updating him on what had happened in their lives in the past 2 weeks, but also updating their father on their own development as politically conscious individuals, their own understanding of the wider world around them as Europe headed towards the cataclysm of the Second World War. And what it afforded was something that's exceedingly rare for a historian, which is a child's eye view of a dramatic period in history. But also, I cannot stress just how extraordinary the document is, how accomplished they were for two what were kids. Their drawings are beautiful. The colors are so rich and vibrant. There's so much humor and character and wit. And there's so much detail that, again, you just wouldn't get in any other source. So when they would move country, Elisa would draw a little comic strip showing panel by panel, how they moved from one place to another, the people they encountered on the way, the boats they took, the trains they jumped on. It's just it really blew me away. I remember Pedro telling me when we first talked over phone that he had this document and he just could not prepare me for how remarkable it was going to be, because I thought in my mind, children's drawings, it's going to be very abstract. The kind of thing that I would have produced when I was Elisa's age just would have been nothing close to what this was.
Yeah, it's very humbling, I think, when you see just how precocious and how talented these young children are in
Yeah,
this
yeah,
hugely stressful time. And I'm reminded one of the pictures in your book shows the family being reunited in London.
yes,
And there's a beautiful drawing and it's poignant. And of course, their father at that time has become sick, and
yes,
so
yeah,
there is this is all playing out, and he's such their father is such a poignant character because he's the guy that gets it. He sees it. He understands the threat of fascism. He's condemning the Nazis before the beer hall putsch, which I think is what 1923. He gets the threat of Hitler, and he's doing everything to try and stop it. He believes that he can actually stop it in some way
hmm
or
hmm
undermine it. And it's just this horrible tale of failure in a way. Not his
yeah,
failure, but there's a sorrow to it.
for sure. And that was what was really striking about this story. And I guess in terms of its contemporary resonance, Edo Femin, he really did believe that the fate of European history rested to some degree on his shoulders. Now, that was a very grand thing to believe. Obviously, it did not. But the stress of being unable to thwart the move towards the Second World War certainly contributed to the stress that led to his stroke, a debilitating stroke that he suffered in 1939. And what was so remarkable to me among the documents that I found in Galicia were these doctor's notes that I saw in the book. And it's a doctor writing to Emmy, telling her that your partner, Edo, needs to stop reading the newspaper. He needs to read trashy detective novels. And it's a very resonant experience because you think of opening up a social media feed and just the stress that it leaves you with. And the actual physical reaction that we all have to this kind of rolling news feed. Edo was experiencing that in the 1930s. And in many ways, it was a much more real experience for him because as his resistance networks went dark, he started to get letters from people who were trapped behind enemy lines asking for help to get them out. And he did what he could, but one of his closest collaborators were two of his close collaborators were two brothers, one of whom was killed in a Gestapo interrogation cell. The other was found uh, close to death on a death march outside of Dachau by American soldiers in 1945. He had a sense of those fates being on the horizon for his collaborators and a sense again of physical futility because he was bedbound. And the only respite he really had was the fact that in 1940, it is the first time that him and his partner, Emmy, and their two daughters can all live together. That's in London. And then they move to Mexico, which is where Edo dies in 1942.
One of the things that strikes me about the book is the complexity of intertwined stories. You are not doing a singular biography, but by a biography of a network. How do you decide what's pertinent, what goes in, and what doesn't go in? Because I imagine there's a lot of other archival material that you came across that could potentially have been included in the book. So I don't know how many lives you really tell in detail in the book. I didn't count them,
Mm.
but you certainly sketch at least 10 people quite thoroughly, probably
Yes.
more, in the space of a book that's what, 300 pages long?
Mm.
So how do you balance all that? Because it's really impressive.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you think that because it was my big fear of the book was that it would seem that I couldn't hang all these lives together because there are quite a lot. There's certainly lives, people who lived in the Hotel Luxe at that time, who I did edit out of the book. Hopefully, I'll do something with that research down the line. I did establish a certain number of guiding principles. The main one was about using Mayo Callahan, this Irish woman, as the central figure. And I wanted her to be, in some senses, not just my perspective, but the reader's perspective. So no one is really introduced in the book until they entered Mayo Callahan's life. So I'm expanding the social circle as she experienced it. To the best of my ability, I also just kept within the central narrative threads those who remained connected to Mayo Callahan. So this story that we've just been on about the Leonhard family throughout their lives, not just in that period in 1930s, but actually up to Emmy's death in Geneva in 1976, she's in touch with Mayo Callahan's world. Even after Mayo Callahan herself dies in 1973, she's in touch with Mayo Callahan's friend Nellie. What's going on behind the scenes is establishing Mayo Callahan as a point of view character. There were some structural things I did. One thing that I learned, someone at the start of the process told me to read a book about screenwriting, and that was helpful in adopting this structure. The chapters are broken down into smaller numbered sections. They go 1, 2, 3, 4. I think the most in one chapter is 9 or 10. Those smaller numbered sections, what they are, and I don't make this explicit in the book, but I hope it helps readers get through it. Those sections are, in cinematic terms, location changes. If you were to take your camera and your set and your actors and move to a different room, that's when I do a paragraph break. So you're in the hotel. Now I'm moving to a scene where you're translating the Kremlin Palace. That's a section break. So those little techniques that are behind the scenes, I hope help readers to keep all the stories in their mind.
I think it works beautifully and it reads beautifully. And Mayo Callahan is obviously the character, and she goes through this huge transition, right? She's a committed revolutionary. She starts off as a suffragette and then evolves into a committed revolutionary, fetching up in Moscow, a long way from her native Wexford. And and afterwards, I think her revolutionary fervor fades. She finds herself on the wrong end of the clash between Trotskyists and Stalinists and fades away. But her connectivity continues, as you said. She's still talking to or writing to Emmy Leonard in the 1970s. And she plays roles, important roles in the lives of characters. And I want to talk about one other Irish character that appears, and that's Liam O'Flaherty. Now, Liam O'Flaherty had a love child that you reveal in this book. Was that a known fact beforehand that Joyce Cohen was Liam O'Flaherty's daughter, or was that something that you found out yourself?
It was known that Liam had 2 children. The circumstances around that daughter's birth, Joyce, were not known. So those were something that I uncovered, and which was a really fascinating part of the story. Liam O'Flaherty, Aran Islands born writer, quite still well known in Ireland, although not much of his work is in print today. He was certainly on the curriculum when I was studying, and he was around a long time too. I think he died in 1982, so quite a long life. Still remembered by a few Dubliners as a kind of a barfly, pronouncing in various Dublin pubs. But in the 1920s, he was at the peak of his literary prowess. He was really in line to be a kind of almost an inheritor to Joyce's title in some senses. That career went a little bit off the rails. Maybe he peaked a little soon, but in the 1920s, Mayo Callahan in Moscow began reading his works and really loved them. And he, through Mayo Callahan, was translated into the Russian language. It was the first language into which his books were translated. And that, as I talk about in the book, it gives me an excellent moment of narrative excitement where the translations, the production of those translations leads pretty much directly to the birth of this second child, this daughter born from an affair he had with one of Mayo Callahan's close friends in 1928.
Now, I am unfortunately constrained by time, as are you, and I'm not going to go into some of the other extraordinarily interlinked revelations that come out in the course of this book. I'll just simply remark that there's a richness and intimacy to the story that you tell that makes it for an exceptional read. And since we're coming up to Christmas time, I can't recommend this book enough as a gift for the history-loving nerd in your family or somebody that loves memoir or just simply excellent writing.
Thank you.
Big kudos to you. But before we sign off, tell me, what's the next big project for Maurice Casey?
Yeah, so I'm in the early stages of what I'm imagining as you could think of it as a sequel to Hotel Luxe in a way. I guess I'm establishing a format where I'm interested in a single interesting place and time, how the people got there, what happened when they were there, and what happened afterwards. And I've discovered this really fascinating story. I discovered it actually on the sidelines of my work on Hotel Luxe about a cafe in 1930s London, a vegetarian restaurant, in fact, that became a hub of anti-Nazi activity. So if the first book was Hotel Luxe, then all going to plan, the second book will be Cafe Vega. So then I just need to find a third hospitality establishment, and then I'll have this trilogy of revolutionary hospitality.
Will it come with recipes as well?
The couple who ran that vegetarian restaurant published a cookbook in the 1960s. I have it here. And yeah, one of the plans, in the way that I like to put myself in the book, I'm gonna live on the diet for a while. I'm gonna see whether that impacts my revolutionary thinking.
Yeah, we'll have to co-opt a chef into this whole experience.
Yeah.
And you need to do a revolutionary diet, a vegetarian diet for Revolutionaries Evening. So, Maurice, can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. It's been a total pleasure to ask a few of the dozens of questions that I have.
Thanks so much, Martin. And thanks so much for reading it so closely. I really appreciate it.
No, it's wonderful, and I can't recommend this book enough. It's a great piece of work, and I'm really looking forward to Restaurant Vega when it makes its appearance. Knowing you, that'll probably take quite a few years. The research is exceptional, but yeah, we look forward to more encounters going forward, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season and good things happen for you in 2025. So on behalf of our listeners and myself, thanks for spending some time with us.
Not at all. Thanks so much, Martin, and a happy Christmas to everyone listening in.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.